Hello everyone and you're welcome. This is going to be a quick material breakdown on how I created this nice fabric material that has this pattern designs, and you can actually see it has some other patterns scattered around this. This is using the new spline tools, path and spline tools. If I click on the library and go over spline tools and path tools, these are the tools I'm talking about. So I'm going to be using them using the tile sampler and tile generator. So let's go ahead and just begin. So the first thing I did was to create a basic pattern, and basically what I tried to do was create a shape that looks like an X, and the X is going to be vertical and horizontal. So this is the vertical version, and this is the horizontal one, sorry, and then this is the standing vertical version. And I achieved this by first creating a circle shape. So this is just a shape node. I created a circle shape. I set the pattern to disk and the size at 0.8, and I created another shape tool with the scale at 0.4, which is basically half of this, and I passed this into a blend node as the blending mode subtract with the opacity at 1. And basically what I did again was to create a shape. This is another square shape with the pattern set to square, and I set the scale to 0.55, and then I used a transform 2D to move the shape to the right. So basically it's the same shape, but I'm moving it to the right using the transform 2D, and the reason why I'm moving that is to hide this half of this shape right here. So imagine having a nice rectangle shape here, and then I'm using that to hide half of this, which is why it's looking like this, because half of it is actually hidden. So what I want to do next was to add a little bevel node here, just to add some nice soft gradients along the edge. And then basically what I did was to mirror this using the mirror grayscale node, and I set the axis to the mode to mirror axis X. Pretty much that's what I did here. So we can actually have the first horizontal shape, and to have a vertical version of this shape, I just duplicated this node and then mirrored the same thing, and then used the transformation 2D node and then rotated that to set it at an angle of 90 degrees clockwise or counterclockwise. But basically you can still rotate the shape by holding the edges here and holding shift to set that at a 90-degree angle. So basically that's how I was able to create that shape rotation. I'll just set this back to the default rotation so we can have that. So basically that's what I did to create that base shape. Now you can use the spline tools to create the shape from scratch, but I just felt very comfortable since this is the method I use mostly when I want to create custom shapes, and coming from Affinity Designer and Adobe Illustrator, I just like using booleans to hide things, cut things, and mask things, but there are better ways to do this. Whichever method works is super fine. You can even bring in a bitmap image with the pattern you want to extract and just drop that in so you can actually bypass this stage. And with that, that's our basic stage. Now next, I'm actually using a tile sampler to create a tile sampler setup. So let's quickly look at the tile sampler setup right here. So I have created a tile sampler, and basically what I'm doing is to pass in the vertical and horizontal designs. Basically this one, you can actually see I'm taking the input from that one and then taking the input. So the input from the vertical one and the input from the output from the horizontal one, I'm passing this into the inputs of the tile sampler. So for the tile sampler, I've set the pattern. Let me just go ahead and open up the pattern. I've set the pattern to pattern input, so you can actually have a custom pattern input. That's why we're able to get the input from this shape here, mirrored grayscale image. And then I created the pattern input number. I set that to 2 so that I can have 2 pattern inputs. If I step this up to 3, it's going to create another input slot where I can have another pattern input, but I'll just set this back to 2 because I'm using only 2. So I'll just go ahead and set this back to 2. And also next, what I also did was to set a pattern input distribution, and I set that to pattern number. So basically what this means is it's going to take the first pattern and then place the second pattern, take the first pattern, second pattern, and keep repeating these patterns. Now if we actually look over here, it's the same pattern we have here. We can actually see from the shape, this is the horizontal shape, and then this is the vertical shape right here. To see this clearly, if I go over to the scale, because I also increased the scale, I set it to 1.41. Let me just drag this scale down a little bit so you can see what I'm talking about right here. So this is actually the pattern. We can see the horizontal pattern and the vertical pattern. Basically, that's what I have repeating. And I'll just set this back to 1.41. So I'll just do a 1.41, and this actually helps to close the interstices or the spacing between each shape. It just closes it out and then gives me a nice shape like this. Let me just go ahead and set my parent size to a 1K texture just to improve the performance, because I'm recording this as well, so it's basically kind of like slightly slowing down the system. But at a 1 scale parent size, it's actually a lesser resolution. And if I set it to 512, it's even going to perform better, but I'll just leave it at 1K because I believe I can manage this. So what I did next is to take this invert grayscale node and also use the levels node to adjust this. Now I left this, created this blend node in case I wanted to add extra details to the texture materials, which I did later on. I did it at this stage here. I added some of those details like the purling noise, warp, another warp with cells 1 and 2, and blend. So the reason why this blend mode is here is just to make sure in case I want to add any edits or any combinations or any shapes or patterns, I can do that. And the reason why I have this invert grayscale is just so it can take the invert the black and white parts, and this will actually help you create customization on your design. For instance, if I turn on the invert and set it to true, it's going to invert this pattern and I'll be getting a different pattern look like so. But I kind of like preferred this one, so I'll just go ahead and set the invert back to true, so it's going to use the basic pattern design over here. And I think this looks nice with a rounded cylinder as well, so I'll just leave it at random cylinder. But you know, just so you can see how this is going to look like when it's used on a wallpaper or something. But cloth is also a nice pattern as well. So let's keep on moving. For the levels, I just set these values and change the level in height to 0.42, level in mid to 0.88, and level in out to 0.48, so I can have a nice flat tone or grayish tone for that matter. Now what I'm doing here at the top is the same thing I'm doing here and also at the bottom. So if you understand what I'm doing at the top here, what's happening at the bottom shouldn't be, you know, any different. We're just mixing the same vertical and horizontal nodes with the tile sampler and then creating information for the splines. So that's the tile sampler setup. Now for the spline mask, before I jump into the spline mask, I want to just go ahead and explain what's happening here, and I have set up a basic example here at the top. So what we're actually doing is to take our basic shape right here. So we have a shape, we can use a star shape or a square shape. Any shape is okay and it's good to go. And the next thing we're going to do is to use this mask to path. If I go to the library and we're right here, we can actually I'll just use a shift and space bar on this section and turn this to large icons. And what we're going to do is to go to our splines and path tools. I'll just click on this path tools, and basically this is what we're using. We're using the mask to path. We're taking a grayscale black and white image or any pattern, either a tile texture or a single pattern, and we're converting that into a path. So that's what this mask to path is doing. So if I double click on the mask to path, we can't actually see anything. We're only seeing the pixel information that contains information about the points or lines in the path. To actually see the mask to path, we need to use this preview, and we can actually see our star shape, and we can actually see these borders around it. Again, to see a paths preview, I'm going to use a preview paths node. So if I click on this, this is the exact actual path we're seeing. I'll just maximize this. So this is the path that it's actually drawing from that mask. So we have a 2D image, it's extracting the path, and that's what the preview does. The preview only just shows us the information about that path. Now the path to a spline is going to take the information from our path, and remember, to see that we need to click on the preview. It's going to take the info on our path and then convert that into a spline, and basically this is data that is going to contain the curve points. And to also see that, we need to use a spline renderer. So if I click on this spline, we can actually see the shape it has created here. So the preview path is to preview the vector path, and then the spline renderer is to render the curves for the spline. And basically that's the spline renderer. It has a lot of options as well, and we can change things like the segment amount. By default, I believe it's on 32, and this makes it kind of like blocky, but we can set this up to 64. Also, if we click on our mask to path, we actually have some options right here that we can use to do things like smooth our mask and also decimate our path, basically reduce or increase the resolution of our mask. And then we have things like the corner threshold as well. So basically, if you have a path and it's not really looking, the way you want it to look, and maybe it's looking blocky, especially when you have, a tile map or repeating patterns, you can use these values to kind of like smoothing the edges of your mask, and then use this value as well to change it, and then also use this to smooth your mask so you can have a very sharp edge that is tight and precise. So basically that's what's happening here. So let's go ahead and jump in to our example. So here I have my black and white mask. If I click on the mask to path and click on preview and kind of like zoom in, we can actually, let me just maximize this using shift and spacebar. We can actually see that we have a path around each of our shapes. So it's extracting that data and drawing the path around our shape. So that's what this is doing. And I was able to see that by going to the preview. Another important node is the path select node. So what the path select is going to do is to separate each of these paths so that you can select them. You can select them based on a length or based on an ID. So I have this based on length, and basically what this is going to do is to allow me to be able to select the different shapes or designs from each path. If I set this to the selection mode to by ID, it's going to change this. So if I click on this and go to the mask to path preview, let me go to my path select and go to my preview path. So it's actually showing me that I have just this one. So I have this as path 10. So this is my, if I go to path select, this is my path ID number 5. So if I go to path ID number 4, it's telling me these are the paths for ID number 4. And if I go back to say ID 3, these are the paths on ID 3. And I'm using the path selection mode by ID. If I switch this to by length, this is going to show me the paths I've selected based on the length, and I can reduce this target length. So it's on 0.63. What if I reduce it to like 0.34? I'm only selecting the circular paths right here. So you can use this to, I think it was on 0.64. Or I could just leave it at 0.6. So basically that's what you can use to select this path. So let's move on. So basically next here I have the paths to spline, and then if I drop this render, basically it's taking that path information from the path select and it's converting this into a spline, and I can actually see the render right here. Now the reason why these lines are slightly dashed is because I've actually messed with some of those settings right here. You can do a lot. You can change the segments, you can change the thickness mode, you can set it to pixel, you can increase or reduce the segments amount, you can draw your spline list, or you can draw a single spline. Basically you can do a lot and play around with this. For instance, we can set the thickness to have a very thick value, or we could just set this down to have a thin value. And basically it's this information we're going to be using into other path tools and nodes. So this brings us to the next section for spline scattering. So I have that spline, and what I want to do is to scatter splines based on a shape. Use shapes around these splines. So let's just go ahead and double click that to see this. Now we can see what's happening here. I have my path. I extracted my path. I converted my path to a spline. Now I'm using a node called the spline scattering to actually scatter this. Now if we go back here and go to our spline tools, excuse me, I'm just going to maximize this, and you can actually see the tools we actually have here. I'm using actually the scatter on spline grayscale to scatter shapes, patterns, or designs along a spline, and that's what I'm actually doing right here. So for the inputs, because it's also wants some specific inputs, you can see I have a pattern 1 input and a pattern 2 input, and just like we have with our regular tile map, we can actually set the patterns we want to use to actually change those inputs. So we can actually have our own pattern input number here. If I go to pattern, I set this to pattern input, and I set the pattern input number to 2. So now what it needs is some specific patterns. So this gives us, get back to here, I just have a shape, and this is the shape, and I used a shape mapper, and I set it to circle. You can set it to polygon to have a variety of the shape. That's going to make this kind of like more curvy, and we can see this output on the design. So I just use the shape mapper, and I set this pixel amount, pattern amount to 5, segments to 8, and I changed the radius to -0.18, and I set the width to 0.96, and I also messed with the rotation. I set the degrees to 169. So basically that's what I have here as my first pattern input, and I'm feeding that into the spline here as pattern input 1, and for pattern input 2, basically using the first shape. So I'm using the circle, and then I'm using this floral shape I created with the shape mapper. You can use more than one input to change it. For instance, if we look at this second shape, I'm actually using 2 pattern inputs. So I have 1, 2, and 3. I'm using 3 pattern inputs right here. I'm using our regular shape mapper, our circle, and then I've added a third one here, which is a square. I've cut out the center, and we can see this on this section right here. We can see it has a square shape with a hole in it. So that's what I used to, and that's how I did this. And then next I added a levels node just to bump some of the colors. Here I added a nice warp node and mixed this with a Perlin noise. I set the scale to 32, and then for the warp node, the intensity at 0.01, and I'm also mixing this with a cells 4 with a scale of 216 and a disk order of 0.29, and I also have a cells 1 with a scale of 27, and I'm blending this just to add some nice variation to this, and I'm adding this to my final blend node, which I'm using to combine this first pattern design with the second pattern design. Now the difference between this one, if I go over to the spline here, so you can actually see this pattern, but if I go over here, you can see that I'm actually using only this section. So what I'm doing is using that spline length to differentiate or select the path I've created, and that's happening over here. So if I go over here to the path select and path preview, this is the path I'm actually extracting here, and this is based off this mask to path here, and I'm using the select by length. So with a length of 0.53, I'm just selecting this diamond kind of like shape, or this star shape, and I'll just show you at the bottom here what I have for the third one. If I go over here and open up my path select, just go over here and preview this, I'm also selecting this based on this length of 0.24. So a lower length is going to select the circles only from this path here. It's only selecting the circles, and then a higher value will select the kites, and another value will select the circle and this spline shapes, so that I can add separate effects to them, combine separate patterns, and then combine them finally on my final node. So for instance, I'm only combining these first two nodes, but over here I could just quickly go ahead and drag this one. So I'll just bring this slightly closer, and what I'll do is just combine this here, and basically this is what I'm having, only just these two shapes. If I want, I can combine I'll put this back in here, and you can see I'm getting my shape back because I'm combining it with this one. And then for interest to make this interesting, what I did was to add and combine some colors. I'm extracting the data from the normal map using a curvature node, and this is how it looks like. It just gives us some information. And next, over here for the color, I'm taking this gradient map and I've mapped this to some basic colors, so you can check out the gradient editor. I'm using a light color for the foreground, and for the background I'm using a slightly pink color, and this is going to affect the colors around the shape of this object. And then next, what I'm doing is to use a blend mode and use a uniform color to combine or fill this color like so we can have some of these yellow edges from this uniform color. It's not a must to use this. I just use that for the color and set the blend mode to multiply. If I want to reduce the effect of that, all I need to do is just drag the opacity slider, set this to 0, and you can see what we have here for this fabric material. I'll set this to cloth, and you can see we have some nice, plain color with just the colors of the gradient map. If I want this to mix, I'll just go over here to the opacity and just drag this slightly up a bit, and I can have some of that orange, and I'll just set this to about 60%, and I think that's fine. So I kind of like this better. And also what I did here with the hue, saturation, and lightness node was to desaturate this by 1 unit and also turn up the lightness a bit. So I turn up the lightness by 0.1, so it's now 0.6. By default it's 0.5. And I just turned down the color a little bit and I left the hue. If you want to change it to any color, if I just drag this to say 0.4 or 0.3, this is going to change the hue, and we'll actually have a bluish kind of color for this material, which isn't looking that bad. I'll set this to 0.4 to see what values we have for the hue, and I'll set this to 0.5 just to set this to a regular color. And this is going to bring us back to our default color, and then for the final output, that's our base color output. Excuse me. Basically that's how I was able to set this up. Also for the roughness, I extracted this final output and passed in the roughness here, and I used a color value. Let's go ahead and see I use a levels node with the mid level at 0.44, the out low level at 0.66. If I don't use this, let's say I have a uniform color and I just pass this in like so, this is going to be very reflective and kind of shiny, and I don't want it to be reflective and shiny. I could just easily use the uniform color and go over here and switch this over to grayscale and set it to a light value so it looks flat and not reflective, because this is cloth. Cloth is not really reflective like that. So, but I just prefer using the levels node because it gives me more control, and it's basically pretty much the same thing I did. And also for our basic setup, I added the ambient occlusion node. You can always search for the ambient occlusion. I use the horizon based ambient occlusion, pass that in, and then use this output to pass this in as a mask. So basically that's how you can use the spline and path nodes to extract path information and then scatter that path information on a shape you already created. So hopefully this is helpful. I'll try and make this available so you can play around with it, scatter it, and see any results, variations you can create with this object. So thank you very much for watching. If you do please like and subscribe to the channel, because it'll help me, be able to create more content and learn more about this powerful tool.